We have something in Norway called the spending rule, handlingsregelen, which you first as a brilliant student of economics worked on, then as a Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister and so on. And it's a rule which tells how much of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund can be spent every year to support the budget. And it's really been a cornerstone in the economic planning in this country. Now, what inspired you to create this rule?
It was the understanding that Norway was going to get a lot of revenues from the oil and gas, and much bigger revenues than we expected. And therefore, when I was Prime Minister in 2000, then we actually had only net oil revenues only for a few years. The first net oil revenues came to Norway in 1996. In the beginning, they were quite small. Then it was obvious that we needed some way of deciding how much we could spend. And we were very afraid of what we refer to as Dutch disease, to spend too much. Therefore, we started partly in a kind of academic, but also then a political discussion on how to establish a fiscal rule for how much of the oil revenues we could spend. And the purpose was actually twofold. One was to ensure that not only our generation, but also future generations get the benefit of the oil and gas resources that we have found on the Norwegian continental shelf. That's a kind of long-term perspective. The other reason to establish the fiscal rule and the pension fund was to ensure that we could stabilize the Norwegian economy, to separate earnings from spending and prevent overheating of the economy. And therefore, we established the pension fund, and the first money was allocated to the pension fund in 1996. But perhaps as important was this fiscal rule, where we decided that all the oil and gas revenues was going to go into the Norwegian pension fund, and then that the only thing we're going to spend was the financial return, which we estimate to 3% in real terms per year as an average. And therefore, the fiscal rule says that we should only spend, on average, the fiscal return of 3% estimated, and that has served Norway very well.
It's quite a feat to manage to get political consensus around the spending of such vast resources, and probably one of the successes of, one of the main successes of the fund. Has it worked the way you thought?
Yes, and if anything, it had worked even better, partly because the fund has become much bigger than we expected, for many reasons. Oil and gas production at the Norwegian continental shelf has been bigger, prices have been higher, and we also have good investments because of people like you have been able to manage the fund in a very good way. So the combination of all these things have made the fund much bigger, and therefore also the fiscal rule more important.
If you had, at the time when the fiscal rule was made, had also made a rule for how much in total could the fund contribute to in percent of the budget, what do you think that percentage would have been?
I think it would have been lower than the current percent, which I think is now
north of 20.
25%, or roughly almost one quarter of the Norwegian state expenditure or state's budget is financed by the return from the oil fund.
So instead of 25, what do you think it would have been? If you
no,
had
I am not able. I know, but then I think it's important in a way. As I'm not able to give you an exact number, but I think it's also important to understand that there are concerns, and I'm careful being going too much into that debate, because that's a very Norwegian debate, and I'm careful being too specific on issues I've not worked so close with over the last years. But I think that the idea back in 2000 when we made the fiscal rule was in a way that this was going to it could last forever, because in one way Norway has spent zero of the oil revenues. The only thing we have spent is the fiscal return on the oil revenues. And of course that can last forever, as long as we have the installment. The challenge, and you know that better than anyone else, is that of course we now have so much of our wealth in the stock market, then of course there can be big fluctuations that can have an impact on the Norwegian economy, and that's a new risk which we didn't face, at least not in the same way before. So I'm always a bit careful changing these kind of fiscal rules too often, because that will undermine the credibility. Perhaps it's better to have an imperfect rule which is credible than to always try to run for a more perfect rule, but which is constantly changed. That will, because this is a self-imposed restriction, and the biggest success in a way is that a democratic society, as Norway, has been able to handle this enormous amount of cash without spending it. I remember back in the 1990s when we had this discussion and started to invest in equities and had the first allocations to the pension fund. Many experts, also economists, colleagues of mine, said this cannot happen. The democratic institutions, politicians, they will spend. If they get the money, they will spend. So they were actually in favor of reducing the oil and gas production to keep the wealth in the continental shelf. And the actual former governor of the Norwegian Central Bank, Hermod Skånland, he led an expert group, and they said, it cannot work. Politicians will spend if they get the money. We have proven them wrong. And that's the biggest success. But again, if you start to change these rules too often, you may undermine, in a way, the magic of the line in the sand, which is the fiscal rule.
I think we can say well done, Norwegian politicians, and well done, the Minister of Finance.
And the management and the NBIM and all those who have been responsible.